Greetings, fellow conquerors, this is darkfireslide, and in today's video I'm going to be talking a bit about some comments I got on a previous video and some thoughts that have been thrown around recently regarding the Ming patch and especially the changes to naval ideas and sailors that popped up as a result of patch 1.21, which is currently in the works. Now, we've come to this kind of crossroads where the idea of game balance in EU4 is sort of a controversial one, to say the least. A lot of people are of the opinion that, well, EU4 is a historical game, and so balance doesn't matter. What matters is historical accuracy and, more importantly, plausibility. You know, could this plausibly have happened? You know, more so than could it actually have happened. The other side of it seems, is of the opinion that, well, it's a game, and so game balance matters. It matters that everyone has a fair chance and an ability to do something, And the thing is, with the EU4, there are two major concepts, I think, that make the game both interesting and fun. Those two concepts are asymmetry and abstraction. Neither of these concepts are particularly new to gaming. Asymmetry is what makes the game interesting, and abstraction is what makes the game possible. So let's talk about those two concepts a little bit more in depth. So first of all, we have asymmetry. Asymmetry is the idea that two sides are not equal to they are not exactly the same as one another, but they are equal. So let's talk about how EU4 kind of handles this concept. Now, first of all, EU4 is, above all else, it tries to be historically plausible before anything else. And so, from a purely game balance perspective, EU4 is not balanced. In fact, some would call this horrendously imbalanced, that nations like France and England and, well, especially France, Castile, and the Ottomans get hilariously powerful ideas, a much stronger start than the others, and it's basically, if you know what you're doing and you know how to play the game, it is basically impossible to do poorly as these nations, barring some weird situation where you get a coalition or something. But again, that comes down more to player mistakes than, your own mistake, than, the game's mistakes, as it were, or the game's situation that you've put yourself in. However, things get more interesting when you get outside of Europe, where you don't have these major powerhouses just sitting around. In particular, let's look at a nation like Ayutthaya, which I'm currently doing a Let's Play on. Ayutthaya has no military ideas except for national manpower modifier, plus 10%, which is pretty bad. All of their ideas pertain to trade and administration, and they're not even that great, in all honesty. However, if we look at let's see, not Tripura, I think it's Manipur. So let's go to Manipur here, one of the more famous one province minor starts for its difficulty. And let's just look at what we get here. So we get looting speed plus 25% and shock damage received minus 10%, both of which are pretty powerful. National unrest -1 is pretty good. Morale of armies plus 10% is pretty good. Your yearly legitimacy is great for monarchies. Tolerance of the true faith is pretty great. National manpower plus 10% is kind of meh. But diplomatic relations and reputation, both +1, are pretty great. With their ambition of fort defense plus 15%, not really be all that great. However, we can see kind of a difference here. So Manipur only starts out with 4 development. They're basically just a tribe living here in the middle of the forest. Compare this to Ayutthaya, which has 91 development, including 2 vassals at the start of the game. And we can kind of see the asymmetry that Paradox goes for in EU4 to make it interesting, in my opinion. Now, so the idea is, if you play a smaller nation, typically, what you're going to find is that you get better national ideas, sort of as a reward for playing a harder start. Smaller nations do tend to have better national ideas than the bigger ones, so this isn't exactly true, with Europe being a great example of the opposite of this happening. Now, if we take a look at Brandenburg, who starts with 57 development, which isn't a great amount, they do, however, get Prussian ideas, which are arguably the strongest military ideas in the game, and, if my voice can stop cracking, and, as well, they also get access to the Prussian government once they form Prussia itself, which can give them additional bonuses and make their country even stronger. So that's kind of how EU4 handles asymmetry, and it's one of the things that makes the game the most, basically just the most interesting thing in terms of strategy that it could be, right? Because you have all these different possibilities, and As a result, we see a lot of situations happen where the AI even will start, as these smaller nations, and it will take over and overcome the larger nations, and you'll see larger, regional powers than you normally would, perhaps historically. And that's what makes EU4 fun, is that it's not just a historical simulator where the big nations just kind of stomp on literally everyone with no challenge. That's what makes the game interesting, at least to a large group of people. Now, the other side of things is abstraction. So what is abstraction, and how does EU4 handle it? Abstraction is taking a concept and turning it into a game mechanic in a way that players and a computer can understand it. For example, the best example of this is mercs. Mercenaries in EU4 don't really make much logical sense. You basically turn money into human beings, which doesn't logically make much sense, and if you count the amount of mercenaries lost over the course of a war, for example, especially if your entire army is composed of mercenaries, it doesn't really make much sense that there's just these groups of hundreds of thousands of mercenaries just sitting around waiting to get paid and get sent into war. But the point is, though, that this is an abstraction. This is meant to represent a concept in the game, and that concept is the idea of money versus manpower. The idea being, if your country is rich enough, you can sort of overcome the limitation of manpower. That is what mercenaries do, and that's why it's an abstraction, and that's why it's in the game as is. Historically speaking, if we were doing real mercenaries, they'd only really comprise probably a few thousand, maybe a couple, tens of thousands, but certainly not the raw amount of manpower that we currently see from them. Now, that being said, that's not necessarily a bad thing, I don't think. The reason that it exists is because, like I said, nations with a lot of money may not have a lot of manpower. A great example of this is Venice. Venice is in a great position to make a lot of money from trade and their trade node, and as a result, they're able to get a lot more money than they are manpower. And so, comprising a Venetian army of a lot of mercenaries makes a lot more sense, and it is an option available to them because they have so much money. So when we combine these two concepts of asymmetry and abstraction, we kind of come to the issue of game balance itself. Now, one thing I think a lot of people misunderstood about what I said in my naval ideas video is that I want everything to be equally useful all the time, and that's not true. What I actually want is for ideas to be good at what they're supposed to do and allow a player options, because one of the most interesting things about EU4 is the idea group system, which allows you to essentially customize your nation with certain bonuses over the course of a game. And this is great. It's one of the things that makes playing EU4 so interesting every time. Even though a lot of nations control the same, the national ideas make it so that in certain situations, you might want one thing over the other. Nations in trade nodes will want to take trade ideas, for example. Nations outside of them would probably want to take things like influence instead. And so that's great. The only problem is, some idea groups are, in my opinion, objectively better in almost all situations than others. For example, if we compare naval ideas to aristocratic even, or pretty much any of the, top 4 military idea groups, being quality, quantity, defensive, and offensive, naval ideas, not only do you get a bonus to your navy, it's true, but the problem is most of the fighting in EU4 is done on land. And this means that taking naval ideas puts you at a disadvantage compared to your opponents, and the advantage it provides is not good enough to justify throwing away the most important aspect of the game, which is land warfare, in my opinion and in my experience. Now, if you constantly play as nations like England, Sweden, Denmark, or the Netherlands, your mileage may vary. That being said, even a nation like Japan can usually overcome the navy of a mightier nation like Ming fairly easily through a little bit of development and without the use of national ideas. One of the biggest problems is that naval ideas is superseded by quality ideas, because quality ideas provide some substantial bonuses to the navy, while also giving you good bonuses to your land army as well, and not including but not limited to combat ability and discipline. And so when I say that naval ideas needs to be made better in a way, it's not that it's not necessarily that it's bad at what it does. It's that another idea group does what it does basically, and it also gives you a bonus to the aspect of the game that's the most important. So in that regard, I think that naval ideas should be made basically to give bonuses to land in some way. And that's why. Because there is this idea of asymmetry and abstraction, and we need to make it so that naval ideas are abstracted in a way that still provide a bonus to land, because that's the most important part of EU4. If we take a look at maritime ideas as well, doing things that other diplomatic idea groups do would also help improve it. For example, improving your trade would be a great thing to do. Now, that being said, maritime ideas does give you a bonus to your force limit, which you can use to build more trade ships and trade with. This is not something that happens with naval ideas. Naval ideas is essentially the quality ideas of, ships. But that isn't really that great, and it's arguable that by itself, quality ideas is one of the weaker military idea groups, just after aristocratic, in my opinion. So all that being said, I think we need to understand that about EU4, that asymmetry and abstraction make the game fun, but game balance comes down to making a lot of different options viable to different countries depending on the situation. Nations like England and Japan and even Ayutthaya and other nations in the area should want to take naval ideas. They should want to focus on their navy because they're on a coastal area. It makes sense that they would want to increase their, the ability of their navy. But in reality, you typically don't, because other idea groups are better at doing the things that naval and maritime ideas are supposed to do in the first place. So all that being said, I hope I provided an interesting perspective on this. If you liked the video, be sure to like and leave a comment below with your thoughts. And of course, subscribe if you want to see more EU4 content in the future. Until then, Godspeed, and I'll see you on the next one.